Hi, I'm Malcolm Williams, Chief Executive of the Shipwrecked Mariners Society. And on the centenary of its introduction, I want to explain why the ocean convoying of merchant ships was adopted so late in the course of World War I, and its impact on the terrible losses of ships and men. By the beginning of May 1917, Britain had lost 1,188 merchant ships, totaling 3.7 million tonnes, and with it over 6,000 lives. And British warehouses held only 6 weeks' supply of essential food. Why? The mercantile marine, as it was then known, was vital to the war effort and Britain's survival. It continued to move our exports of manufactured goods, coal and industrial plant, and brought in the raw materials for manufacturing, and essentials such as food, munitions, horses and troops. 46% of the country's calories were imported. Losses were severe. In August 1914, 9 British merchant ships were lost to German surface ships and mines, but none to submarines. By April 1917, the monthly figure had risen to 169 merchant ships. That is some 545,000 tonnes of shipping. But what was different was that none were lost to German surface ships, but 155, that is 92%, were lost to submarines and the balance to mines. The problem of how to protect merchant ships had been considered long before the war. The 1905 report of the Royal Commission on the supply of food and raw materials in time of war concluded that the concentration of our forces will be the most effective protection that can be given to our trade from attack by enemy men of war. That protection could best be assured by having sufficient cruisers to keep the enemy's commerce destroyers continually on the lookout for their own safety. The hunting approach to shipping defence. The Commission was of the view that with a strong fleet, we find no reason to fear such an interruption of our supplies as would lead to the starvation of our people. At that time, the submarine was in its infancy, though in the year in which the Commission reported, Germany launched an experimental submarine. How things were to change. Then in 1908, it was concluded that by leaving the owners in charge of their own ships, and every vessel would therefore have its own brain, so to speak, working out its own safety. So the bold policy was adopted of urging merchant shipping to continue its operations with the dispersal of trade away from the usual routes and leaving British cruisers free to hunt down enemy warships. The option of convoying was firmly rejected. Ship owners and masters were generally opposed to convoys, the main reasons being the dangers of station keeping at night and in bad weather with different ship speeds. A convoy was a large target. A convoy had to proceed at the speed of the slowest ship. Departures would be delayed while the convoy assembled. The enemy would get to know of the convoys, and there were insufficient Royal Naval escorts. Naval opinion was divided, but there was a strong view that convoying wasn't sufficiently offensive as a policy and that there were not enough escorts for the task. In early August, all shipping intelligence officers were ordered to advise British shipping to steer courses parallel to and from 80 to 150 miles distant from regular track. Endeavour to fill up sufficiently with coal to avoid bunkering on passage, reduce the brilliancy of lights, and when obliged to pass through localities where traffic is most congested, endeavour to do so at night. Use neutral territorial waters when possible. On the 4th of February 1915, Germany declared that from the 18th of February, the English Channel, the north and west coasts of France, and the waters round the British Isles are a war area, that all enemy ships found in that area will be destroyed. This was unrestricted U-boat warfare. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 and then the Arabic, with the loss of American passengers, led to diplomatic protests and an ultimatum to Germany from the US. This brought the first phase of unrestricted submarine warfare to a close, but it didn't stop continuing attacks on merchant shipping. From May 1915 to January 1917, 510 ships were lost to submarines and 33 to surface ships, a total of 1.7 million tons, with a loss of 2,976 lives. Then, on the 1st of February 1917, the German High Command declared unrestricted submarine warfare against all Allied shipping. In February, 86 ships totaling 256,000 tons were sunk by submarines, with a loss of 355 lives. Despite these losses, at a meeting in late February between the naval staff and ship owners, the notion of convoying was still dismissed. Fortunately, there were a few who didn't share that view. Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the War Cabinet Committee, was most probably the conduit for those who believed that convoying was now necessary. On the 12th of February, he wrote a memorandum to the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, forcefully making the case for a system of scientifically organised convoys. In April 1917, the monthly tally of destruction had risen again to 155 vessels and over 500,000 tons, with 997 lives lost, and the government was looking at the drastic curtailment of imports at a time when there was only 6 weeks' supply of food left in the country. Admiral of the Fleet, Jackie Fisher, posed the question, can the Army win the war before the Navy loses it? With the entrance of the United States into the war in April, there was an even greater need for protection of shipping, as large numbers of soldiers and arms would be crossing the Atlantic. Minds were at last changing in the Admiralty, and in late April, the Admiralty Board decided to run an experimental ocean convoy. It sailed from Gibraltar on the 10th of May and arrived safely at Plymouth 10 days later. The first transatlantic convoy left Hampton Roads on the 24th of May, and the ships reached their destination ports with only one loss. The next transatlantic convoy left Sydney, Nova Scotia on the 22nd of June, and the first from New York on the 6th of July. Losses to submarines in May were 106 ships. In June, this rose to 116 and 391,000 tons, but fell in July to 88 ships and 320,000 tons, and thereafter steadily declined for the rest of the war. Losses of ships in convoy were 10% of those suffered by ships making independent passage, and sinkings of enemy submarines increased from a total of 10 in each of the first 2 quarters of 1917 to 22 in the third quarter. The convoys, instead of being just defensive, were acting as bait for the U-boats, who in pressing home their attacks were in turn exposing themselves to attack by the escorting warships. Anti-submarine warfare was yet in its infancy. There was no effective means of detecting submerged submarines with sufficient accuracy to attack them with depth charges. But the escorts and aircraft now knew where the enemy had to be to sink a merchant ship. It was, after all, an offensive tactic. Between May 1917 and November 1918, a total of 1,100,000 American troops were transported across the Atlantic in convoy, with only 637 of them drowned as a result of German attacks. During World War I, our society assisted some 51,000 sailors, merchant navy and fishermen by providing clothing, food, accommodation and rail warrants to get them home. It also provided financial assistance to the widows, orphans and aged parents of those lost. Now, in its 178th year, the Society continues to provide financial support to fishermen and mariners, albeit in the very different circumstances of today. Last year, we provided assistance in over 2,000 cases of need at a cost of 1.4 million. Anything you can do to support us, whether it's a donation, a standing order or direct debit, or by remembering us in your will, would be very much appreciated by future generations of the fishermen and merchant seamen of our island nation, descendants of those who gave so much to ensure our national survival. Thank you for listening.